We are talking to Professor Harbir Singh of the Wharton School, and the context is really about your book, Professor, which is The Indian Way. So I want to first start out with the question that is there any such thing as an Indian firm? How do you define that?
So actually, the reason why we did the book was we looked at the 100 leaders of the largest corporations in India in terms of revenue, and looked for common themes there. So what we discovered was that there is something that we can call the India way, which is sort of a set of practices, management practices that seem to be fairly commonly applied among these companies. But I think an Indian firm, that's an interesting question. I would say that with the advent of globalization and the license, the repeal of the license Raj, that India is really, the firms have become globally oriented firms. So I would sort of say it's more about the practices than the firms themselves.
You identified four sort of defining practices of Indian firms.
Right.
And I remember reading somewhere that it is aligned to the Dharma, Arth, Moksha, Kama as the four tenets of Hindu philosophy.
Right.
So would you tell us about the four guiding principles of firms that you studied?
Right.
And what did you find is so unique? Especially, did you find them to be different from the model of management that the Western firms have followed?
Yeah. So the four elements, one of the more interesting ones was the idea of a broader mission of the firm in terms of its contributions to society. Clearly, every privately held or publicly held firm will be focused on value in some way or profit, because that's really what a firm is supposed to pursue. That was there. But in addition, perhaps because of the stage of development of India versus where the US is, or because of the post-liberalization period and the opportunity it presented, I was really struck by how many of these CEOs were talking about the role of the firm as a transformative force in society, that they actually saw their firms as instruments of transforming India. And that's clearly an attribute that came out very strongly. That was the first attribute. Second one was engagement with human capital. And we found, and this may be partly out of necessity, because post-liberalization, they had really had to upgrade their capabilities. But what was remarkable was the integration of human resource priorities with strategy was actually quite high, much higher than we see in the US today. And I'll come back to why. The third element was what we call adaptability and improvisation. And this is kind of a long-standing Indian attribute. One of my interviewees actually said it's a little bit like the Indian concept of adjust kar denge. Everything can be adjusted. And that's a uniquely Indian thing. In fact, one of my interviewees who ran a multinational and moved from India overseas and came back, he kind of gave a very interesting point. He said that his managers of Indian origin were much more able to deal with crises than managers from other parts of the world. And his rationale was that, as you know, even now it may be true of India, but more so earlier, you get up in the morning, you don't know whether you have electricity, the traffic problem, something is wrong somewhere, and people just take it in stride and they get to work and they get things done. And that adaptability and resilience which came from the challenges people faced post-independence early on has become a real asset. And the fourth one is the value propositions, and you see that with the bottom of the pyramid ideas that India has. So many ideas. I recently met a gentleman who is coming up with a cellular phone company which will be entirely based on solar operated towers. So the towers will be operated by solar energy. The phone will have very little power consumption, so it doesn't even need a battery. It can be recharged in the sun. That's a proposition that actually is now viable. Now we'll see if it's successful, but that's a creative value proposition. We see a lot of those. So four elements.
Do you think that taking on the first part, which is about employee engagement, if this is so fundamental to Indian organizations, why is it that there is such a high rate of attrition in most
Yes,
organizations.
very good point. So, I think this employee engagement, in fact, some of our interviewees mentioned this employee engagement priority really came about post license Raj because they realized that multinationals are coming in. We really need to upgrade our employees and also retain our best employees. So that happened. That there was an effort at least. But I think you're right. Today, the turnover is higher. To some extent, employees feel that they are free agents. They can go anywhere. The loyalty between the firm and the employee also is not necessarily that high. But I don't think the labor market in India still functions as as fluidly as the US labor market. And so employees tend to want to be engaged with one organization. So while there's attrition and so on, it's not at the level of the US. And similarly, the corporate, on the other side, the corporation is trying to at least retain people. And that again may be because the labor market is not functioning so well, so they need to keep their best capital.
Is there anything that you saw as weaknesses that are common to the Indian firms? I mean, when you studied them,
Right.
what did you see as weaknesses?
So actually, I think one possible weakness is this did not come up from the study per se. This is kind of just an observation outside of the study. But when I presented this work in a couple of conferences in India, one of the pushbacks was, our there's a question of values and ethics in the broader community, the political side of India, and they were asking, of course, you cannot have, ethical issues just on one side. It has to be somebody fueling the ethical issues. So I think that's something people need to pay attention to because there's a transparency and well-functioning markets and disclosure is essential. And lately we've had some scandals which have raised the right kind of questions. So then that's one weakness that we need to address. The second one again is outside of the study, but something that I want to just point out is perhaps a sense of complacency. That sort of things are going well right now, and that's great, but there's a lot to be done, and I think so that drive that brought the growth rate up so much and brought these companies and raised the standard of living, that drive, that hunger needs to remain, and this is a natural human tendency. So we need to retain that hunger.
We are sort of talking about the hunger that drove us, and the logical comparison is always one reads about is India versus China. You very recently at Davos, you were chairing this panel on can India and China really be friends?
Right.
And I just wondered, what is your assessment between the two countries? Where do you see, in the long run, where do you see this race panning out?
Right. So just as a clarification, I was a panelist. There was a moderator, but I was a panelist in the session. But it was a very interesting session, and we had a wide-ranging discussion on India and China. And the summary, at least for me, is that they are vastly different economies, but both have tremendous opportunity. And a lot of the opportunity is domestic. So in fact, it's not India versus China, it's India and China looking at the rest of the world. So that's the first point. In terms of actual differences, I would say that China on the infrastructure is actually is very far ahead. And I sometimes hear discussions in India saying, well, that's fine, but we are good on software infrastructure. And I feel that government and other players really need to take infrastructure seriously because it affects everybody. And so one shouldn't, if another power of about the same size and starting perhaps in the same place 30, 40 years ago has gone ahead, I think people in India need to focus on that and see and ask how much better could India be if it had that infrastructure. Maybe the GDP growth rate would be in double digits every year. So that would be sort of one. So the last answer I'll say though is that things are going very well in both economies, and that's wonderful. I'm very glad to sort of see that. I think it's well deserved, and I hope everybody enjoys the prosperity that comes from that.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Harbir Singh. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.